I'm really grateful, thanks Eleanor, for asking me to come and speak. It gives me a chance to think about Hepworth Studios again and to look a bit more closely at some of the items there. Right. The Hepworth Studios Conservation Project and the research seminar, which Helena convened at the beginning of it, progressed our understanding of Hepworth's working spaces. And of course, we now have Sophie's book as well. So we have a pretty clear picture now of how much of what we see in the studios was arranged and how much is what you might call undisturbed evidence, which there was a bit of discussion about those different sort of states of the items in the studio in the research seminar at the beginning of the project, which I found very useful. So just going on. So the cupboard in the Plaster Studio was identified as one of the most authentic areas, left just as it was and not touched in the preparation of the studios for public display. It contains items that we do know relate to the making of plasters, such as gypsona bandage, kailstone fine casting plaster, etc. But there are other items which look promisingly as though they might relate to work on finished bronzes as well as plasters. These included a tin of bronze shavings, bags and jars of unidentified powder and crystals, plus bottles containing chemicals, specifically metal salts in solution being used to create chemical patinas. So I don't know how well you can see those. I actually had to freeze these off of film. Anyway, hopefully you might be able to see the labels on those. The bottles in the cupboard are better preserved than a lot of the other items in the studios because the environment is slightly buffered within the cupboards. And the paper labels can be easily read, whether or not you can read them in the slide. But many were obtained from T.C. Ledra, the chemist, which is still there in 4th Street in St Ives. Looking more closely at these individual bottles revealed one which is used to colour bronze, copper sulfate, seen here on the left. The other labelled bottles all contain the same chemical, iron sulfate. And one of these, I was looking at the inventory that was made before the project started. One of these says copper, iron sulfate, and there's a handwritten addition on the bottle which looks like it says green coppers, so suggestive of the creation of green copper compounds, i.e. producing a green patination on bronze. But unfortunately, this is not the case. The label actually says green copperas, which is the old name for iron 2 sulfate, which actually, though it has nothing to do with copper. The name copperas dates from times when copper 2 sulfate, which is blue crystals, was known as blue copperas, and so iron 2 and zinc sulfate were known as green and white copperas just because of the colours of the crystals. So you can see here, this is iron 2 sulfate in crystalline form, and the colour looks like a bit like the colour you see on bronze sculptures, but it's nothing to do with it, unfortunately. But interestingly, iron sulfate is sometimes used to colour wood. And the cupboard also contained a small test tube of potassium permanganate and liquid ammonia. Both of these can also be used to colour wood, so I haven't looked into that. I don't know very much about Hepworth wood sculptures. And also, these chemicals have other uses, and liquid ammonia, many, many uses, including just for cleaning. So I can't really deduce much from that. So, being rather disappointed by the cupboard, I thought I'd have a look at the Palais Inventory, which was made during the project. The Palais contents list does yield more chemicals potentially used for patinating. A number of bottles found together in the same area of the Palais, which Sarah was showing us, there was a shot of that area. It was like a corner with lots of bottles in a cardboard box. So these bottles, which were found together in quite sort of reasonable quantities, so they do seem to indicate that patinating was happening on site. So on the left is one of a number of bottles of ammonium hydrosulfide, which is used to create brown patinas and is often sold as liver of sulfur. One of these bottles of ammonium hydrosulfide has a handwritten label which just says bronze ammo sul, so it's clearly being used on bronze. On the right, I'm not sure how clearly you can see that label, it says poison, sal ammoniac. And this is the old name for ammonium chloride, which is a chemical very often used to make a green-blue patina. There are other bottles which are less well identified. One containing white powder is labelled to stain bronze, so intriguing. There's a bottle of blue, sort of turquoise blue salt solution. It's just labelled poison, but that could be copper nitrate, which looks like this in solution. Sorry. But the thing to remember about the Palais, as has been said, is that it's not a space like the cupboard. So we can't infer these chemicals were being used by Hepworth or at her behest. She only worked there between 61 and 67 personally. Then thereafter her assistants, and then it continued as a working space for the estate. So, we can't sort of draw as many conclusions from that. So, there are 3 recorded recipes for creating patinas on Hepworth sculptures that I know of. There's the one included in the Plaster's book for the pale blue-green patina on the family of man that Laura spoke about, and 2 that have come to us via Ted Shepherd of Morris Singer Foundry. There was a correspondence between Ted Shepherd and a conservator, Tracy Power, and unfortunately I can't remember the date of that correspondence, but the Tate has copies which were passed to us by David Valance of Morris Singer. These 3 recipes, let's call them recipes, actually employ a very small range of patinating chemicals. So just these 4 patinating chemicals at the top on the right. Sorry, I've lost my thing. Oh yeah, and then calcium. So you see the 4 chemicals at the top are patinating chemicals, i.e. metal salts, which change the chemical makeup of the bronze surface, and that's what changes the color. And then at the bottom, calcium carbonate, or I call it whiting, because that's what I was always taught to call it, because it's used for gesso and things like that. So it's very, very commonly found for all sorts of reasons in artist studios and foundries. But that was an ingredient in that patina, the cold blue-green patina that Laura was talking about. So it doesn't react with the bronze surface, but it either sort of just is added to it or kind of somehow bonds with the compounds that are being formed. Not quite clear how that happens. So if we look across to the other list, the studio cupboard in the Palais, we can see that all those documented chemicals may actually be present still in the studios and the Palais. And it's not really surprising to find only a small range, as despite the secrecy that surrounds patination recipes, which is how they're often described, and the amount of chemicals which, in theory, can be used to react with bronze and create different colours, you can actually achieve a great deal of variety using a very small range in different combinations and variously applied. So just to illustrate that, this is a few samples that were taken when we had a sort of patination training day recently. And this shows different colours which were achieved using only 4 chemicals. In this case, potassium sulfide, ferric nitrate, copper nitrate, copper acetate. So I'm sure you're keeping up with all these chemicals. But potassium sulfide is it sort of equates, potassium sulfide is the classic chemical for producing that rich brown colour on bronze, and they call it liver of sulfur. In the studio, it was ammonium hydrosulfide. They're sort of used for the same thing, but potassium polysulfide is the one that was included in the Hepworth recipe, Hepworth 1, as they called it, from Morris Singer, made up with just water. So two of the chemicals used here, copper nitrate, copper, sorry, I'm getting confused now. Okay, anyway, you can see there's also the type of wax application can vary the effect. So you don't need very many chemicals to produce a lot of different effects, is what I'm trying to say. And 2 of the chemicals used here ferric nitrate and copper acetate are very common patinating chemicals which were not found in labelled bottles in any of Hepworth's spaces. However, they are both very easily homemade. So back to the cupboard. There are other items in the Plaster Studio cupboard that may be connected with Hepworth's colouring of bronzes. A white powder could be calcium carbonate, as used in the Family of Man recipe, or it could just be plaster of Paris, or it could be a white pigment. We'd have to analyse it to be sure. Pigments found in the cupboard could also have been added to patinating solutions, or to a lacquer like Laura was talking about with the rings. That might not have just been a straight lacquer. There could be a sort of golden coloured pigment like aurora, yellow ochre, burnt sienna type pigment in it. Or they could more likely been used for colouring plasters as a guide to the founders, which we know that Hepworth did. Or they could be connected to other activities, given that Hepworth used the upper studio as a flexible space. But regarding the small quantity of copper sulfate which was found, rereading Sophie's book, I was reminded that the upper studio was where the sheet metal works were made, and these must have been coloured on site. So possibly this was used for that. So I haven't tested copper sulfate on sheet copper. I don't know what the effect is. Now, things you can get a bit carried away with all this stuff, and I like to think, there's this lovely tin of bronze shavings, and I love to think of Hepworth making her own copper acetate up using white vinegar, because that's something that's quite easily done, and it fits with my idea of Hepworth. It's just my idea of Hepworth. Or homemade ferric nitrate, which you can make using rusty nails. So for me, that fits with my idea of how the studio worked, where they saved everything and put these little scraps in bottles, and everything's in pine essence bath bottles, and it just fits with how I feel it works. But it has to just be speculation, I'm afraid. Anyway, just to finish, it's been great to have this opportunity to look more carefully at the evidence for Hepworth colouring bronzes on site. And when I got the invitation to attend this event, I hoped there might be a focus on this area of colour and bronzes, and I quickly wrote some possible research questions, so I'm just finished with those. I'm not going to read them. But I was really happy to find that Laura's talk to start with, and Lindsay's talk, which is following mine, address and answer a lot of the same questions. So that's that.